The day is finally here where I am installing the final leg of my irrigation, which is actually putting drip irrigation into my raised beds. Now, I did promise this a long time ago. This won't be the complete video showing you how to plumb all the PVC, set up all your timers, everything like that. That is still, unfortunately, a project that I am kind of neglecting, and I need your guys' encouragement if I'm ever going to finish it. But I want to show you guys at least how to plumb up your irrigation once you're at your raised bed. So that's what we're going to go over today. I'm also going to do a little bit expansion for some of the in-ground irrigation back there because my giant cabbage field is almost ready to harvest, and then there's also going to be tomatoes going in there. I need to get an irrigation solution in place. We're going to do a little bits and bobs, irrigation for trees, irrigation in ground, irrigation for raised beds. We're going to cover it all today in this video, but we're going to start with this 4x8 bed. Now, every bed I'm probably going to do a little different because I'm trying to test out different methods, different formats to set up irrigation to see what is really my favorite and what I'd like to recommend to you guys the most. The first one here is going to be the most traditional. I'm going to be setting up standard drip tubing like this guy right here. So let's get right into it. Now, really quickly before I install the irrigation, if you're wondering what these are our critter cages. I decided to put over my tomatoes here because this bed has literally been dug up, I think 6 times by raccoons. I know it's raccoons because I set up a GoPro time lapse here the other night. I caught them in the act, but if I had not put these critter cages here, I would not only not have any of my lettuce or spinach, only looks like 6 of my lettuce survived the onslaught of the raccoons, but I would have also lost these tomatoes that I just put in. I already lost the majority of the cauliflower, only 2 remain from the 4 that I originally planted in here. So I'm definitely gonna put these back on, but for now we're gonna get them out of our way so we can install this irrigation system because I want all the space that I could possibly get. The first thing before we start plumbing up the irrigation is I need to set up my actual main line. So this is PVC hooked up to my timer. What I'm going to do is trim it to a height so that this is sitting just at the surface of the bed there. Now, I'm not gonna glue it until the very end, just so I could have a little bit of wiggle room and play around with things. But I already know that right about here is where I need to cut this PVC. So let's go ahead and do a dry fitting, just like that. So I will eventually have to cut this a little shorter. It's sitting a little high right now, but that's good enough for us to start actually stringing up our irrigation. If you guys have hooked up this sort of irrigation before, you know that this can be quite hard to get onto the fittings. Couple tips here is you could just leave it out in the sun for at least 30 minutes before you start working, which is what I did. And if it's still too hard, you could get yourself a hot cup of water, put it in a thermos, dip this tubing in the hot water for like a couple seconds, maybe 10-15 seconds. That'll soften it up. You could slip it on, and then when it cools down, it'll tighten up again on your fitting. Since I left this out in the sun, I'm not too worried. I should be able to slide it on. The other trick I like to do is wiggle back and forth. You're not just pushing straight in. If you wiggle it a little bit, it's going to work its way down those barbs. So the idea here is that I want to come in right at this corner and make use of the curvature of the birdie's raised beds since it's already there. So I'm going to try to angle it. So right here, I like the way this is curving. Now I am going to be cutting this into little sections, but for now, what I'm going to try to do is just stake this down so I can now mentally plan out where I'm going to attach everything. So the way I'm going to do this is use these tees. I'm going to set them up roughly where I think I'm going to be pulling a line from. For now, I just want to lace them out, get a visual. For a 4x8 bed here, at the very minimum, I'm going to want to pull a line every single foot. So a minimum of 4 lines in this bed. But realistically, closer to like 8 inches and running this for a shorter period of time is more of what I want. When you're thinking about setting up drip irrigation, you have to remember that when it drips, that drip of water comes down and it spreads out a little bit. And that width of the spread of water depends on the soil you're using. When you're using raised bed soil, you tend to have a lot of drainage. So that drip of water is not going to travel very far. Rather than having a bunch of widely spaced different drip lines, you want to actually put them a little bit closer together. That way you could have more flexibility when you plant this bed out. You're not just relying on, for example, where a single drip emitter is where you could plant. You want a nice full coverage so you could direct seed into this bed. You could plant smaller things like lettuces throughout here without missing a drip irrigation line. And so that's why I'm going to actually probably shoot for about 8-inch spacing. And then each emitter is going to be spaced at, I believe, 6 inches between drip points. And we're going to talk about how we actually set that up as well. So I'm gonna go grab a tape measure because I want to get this set up as right as possible. And the way we're going to space out this regular old drip line is about 8 inches apart from each line. The reason why we're going that close together is because we want really good coverage across this bed. If you think about a raised bed soil mix, it's going to be very quickly draining. So anytime you put a drop of water in it, it's not going to travel out very far. Maybe it'll travel at the maximum 4 inches apart from where that drip is. And that is why we're going for something like 8 inches. Now, the poorer the drainage is of your soil, the further apart you could space your lines, because that poor drainage means that that water drop is going to slowly work its way into the soil and start spreading out. If you have very sandy soil, for example, that drip of water is going to go straight through, probably not spreading very much at all. So think about that when you're setting up your irrigation. What kind of soil do you have? Is it fast draining? Is it slow draining? And also think about how you're going to use this bed. For example, right now I have mostly tomatoes in here, so I don't need that good of a coverage of water. But let's say I wanted to plant this entirely in bush beans or entirely in lettuce. I'm going to want really good coverage of water across this bed, because those plants aren't going to send out roots as aggressively as a larger plant like a tomato. So by having more lines across this bed, I could have better distribution of water through the soil, and in exchange, I could just water for a shorter amount of time instead of having fewer lines and running it for longer. So that's the basic setup here. We're gonna do about 6 inches from the inside of every side of the bed here. So 6 from there, 6 from here, and then 8 inches between each one of these lines. So a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drip lines for a 4-foot wide bed. Now the next thing we're going to do is cut this line right here, attach these fittings, and then start running our actual drip emitter line. When it comes to cutting drip line, I just like using pruning shears. They seem to work really well for me. So let's go ahead and cut this first one. As I install these emitters, I'm gonna go ahead and put a stake down right around it, because I don't want it to slide every single time I cut it. Remember, you gotta wiggle it like this, and it'll go in much easier, especially now that it, like I said, it's been sitting in the sun. It's also going to be a lot easier to install. And our final irrigation line, I forgot to mention, but it's actually going to be a corner connector, not a T, because we are finishing the line here. We don't want it to continue out towards the edge of the bed. And that's going to complete our main line setup for this bed. Now let's go ahead and grab the tubing and start running all these lines. I'm also going to install some sprinklers, which I'll set up after we set up that main line irrigation. To make this whole process easy, I'm going to put a stack of staples at the end there. Then I'm gonna come down here. I'm gonna grab the start of my line. I'm gonna go ahead and attach it right here. All right, let's run this line out to the end. Now we're gonna move on to another bed, and I'm going to let these lines sort of relax in the heat of the sun before we finish up this bed, just because they're so annoying right now, all curled up. So we'll be right back here, but let's go ahead and set up one of these 4x4 beds. So for this bed, since it's only a 2x4 bed, I don't wanna spend too much time setting up complicated main lines or everything like that. So I'm just going to be pulling straight off the tee using one of these two-way manifolds. So what it is just two little green things coming out the top. You screw it onto your PVC adapter. This is what's now going to be attached to my PVC stub out, which is right there. And then what I could do is I could actually pull 2 drip lines or a drip line and a sprinkler off of this. I actually already set up the bed over there, I'll show you in a second, with a 4-way manifold. So that one has 3 drip lines and 1 sprayer. But let's go ahead and install this guy. I'm gonna have to cut this so it's nice and level. Before I actually glue this in, I'll have to come back in, clean the PVC so it's a nice clean connection. But now all we have to do is install our drip line. So let me go ahead and grab this. This is 6-inch emitter drip line. This is 1/4-inch line, which is the thickness of the actual tubing. The last one was supposedly 1/2 inch, but it definitely looks bigger than this. So all I need to do here is hook it into one of these little green guys, push it all the way to the end. And sort of the way I've envisioned this is I'm going to have one of these lines wrapping around the outside perimeter. So actually, one thing I need to grab are some staples. So I'm gonna go ahead, start right there, and start distributing this line out. Basically, you wanna put a staple every time you turn the line. That's going to keep it from scrolling away from you from the actual location you want it in. So if I put it right here, now I could bend it and I'll have this radius here protected as I pull the line through the rest of the bed. And then what I think I'm gonna do here is actually stop it right here at the edge of where the next one's gonna start. So you'll see exactly what I mean in a moment here. I'm gonna cut that and attach this last line. I think this system is actually quite nice if you don't have a very big bed, you don't wanna deal with setting up a bunch of connectors. It's just one thing with a bunch of little connections on there. And from it, you could pull, in theory, I saw one that goes up to 8 different splits. That would be a little bit crazy looking. But for a bed like this, I'm actually really happy with the solution. The last thing I need to do is close off those lines. So I have what are called these little goof plugs. They're just plugs that are designed to fit into irrigation lines or holes. Like if you goofed up and you added a sprinkler line and now you want to remove it, this is what you would use to seal up that hole. So I'm gonna go right there, and there we go. That was honestly the fastest, easiest irrigation I've ever set up for a raised bed. Just pull a couple of lines and you're done. And with 6-inch spacing, this is going to have very even water distribution throughout. I don't even need like a sprinkler if I wanted to germinate, say, a bunch of carrot seeds. With something like this, I feel pretty confident that I would get good enough water distribution to start just about anything. And now in this bed, I actually do have plans of putting in some potatoes. But yeah, this bed's ready to go. Let me show you the 4x4. It's the same basic idea, except it's a 4-way manifold instead of the 2-way. So here we are in the 4x4 birdie's bed where I have the 4-way split manifold. So I have one line that wraps all the way around the outside, another one that takes the inner loop, and then the last one here completes this inside section. Since I didn't think I needed the 4th one, what I decided to do over here is actually add in a sprinkler. So this is one of those vortex sprayers that just sprays a mist of water. That's going to be ideal if I want to germinate a bunch of little tiny things in here, or just make sure everything in here gets nice and wet. Like let's say it's a really hot day, I want to cool down the plants a little bit. I would go ahead and open this up just like that. And if I don't need it, I just simply twist it shut, and now this is not going to do anything while the rest of the drip lines work. So honestly, I'm pretty happy with these guys. We'll see how they hold up over time, but very easy setup, very simple, and I'm quite pleased with it. Before I move on to the in-ground irrigation expansion, I wanted to go ahead and start PVC gluing these parts together. Now the PVC glue will be a permanent connection. It's also going to make sure this doesn't pop off when I turn it on. It is important that you wipe the pipe itself and actually the piece that you're connecting onto it. Any like little grain of sand or anything like that can cause a leak, or at least potentially cause a leak. So what I'm going to do is now get my primer. It's the purple stuff. What this does is it softens the PVC pipe, makes it easier to sort of make the connection. It also makes that bond stronger. Because what it does is it's essentially melting that plastic a little bit. Then I'm going to come in with the actual cement. It's hard to not put too much. There we go. One wrap like that. And that's actually probably too much cement, but it's okay. This isn't a critical connection here. I do like to wiggle it when I put it on to make sure that it's all nice and spread. And any extra drips like that right there, I'm gonna go ahead and wipe away. So this should set, like I said, about 30 minutes, and we'll come back, run the system, and see how it works. Before we turn on the water and test the system, I have to close off the ends of these 1/2-inch drip tubes. So there's 2 different ways you could get a made closure like this guy here. The reason why I don't like these is because, first of all, they're expensive. They add up very quickly when you start closing each line. And also they add a lot of extra length to the end of your build. So if I wanted a drip emitter right here, I wouldn't be able to do it. I'd have to push it like all the way back here. So for me, they're less flexible and they're more expensive, but I'll show you how to do it anyway. It's the same system as anything else. All you have to do is come in, push it on, just like that. And then you twist this part here, and that's going to seal that tube up against that actual connection mechanism. So there you go. It's a very clean look, guaranteed to work, but I just don't like having to pay for it. Now, the other option is to just use some electrical tape. This is something I picked up from a farmer. I think it was from a farming podcast. But the idea here is that you take the end of your drip tube, like this guy here, you fold it over. The nice thing about this is that you could fold over a very small section and this will still work. I have drip lines that I've sealed like this like 3 years ago and they're still holding up just fine. You take your electrical tape and you start wrapping. The nice thing about electrical tape is that it's very stretchy, which means that you could pull it super tight up against this line, which will guarantee that that's not going to actually drip any water at any point. It's going to be well sealed and last for a long time. But you want to make sure you put a lot of wraps on just to protect it from degradation in the sun and things like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and do a lot of tight wraps now, all the way up to the back end. And there we go. That is a now fully sealed drip line, ready to go and drip some water. So I'm gonna go ahead and close these off, and then we'll go turn this on and see if it works. While we wait for the PVC cement to actually cure, let's go ahead and start building out the irrigation to my giant cabbage patch. So over here is where the main line comes up out of the ground. I did bury this and run it under the pathway here. Comes up to here, splits at a T to a on and off valve, which goes to this bed, which is my pollinator patch. And then previously I had run this out to the garden itself, but when I cut it out to redo this area for the greenhouse, I just went ahead and attached it back to the actual pollinator patch. That was just like an easy way to set it aside and forget about it for a while. So now what we need to do though, is come back into here, cut out that connection to the pollinator patch, and then reassert that line back into the garden. So first thing I'm going to do here is actually just go ahead and cut this part out. And then what I'll do here is actually use one of those more fancy closures just because I don't want to worry about it down here. I just want to set it and forget it. I'm never going to look at this and it might get overgrown. So I'd rather have a fully 100% permanent solution. Let's go ahead and seal that off. So now I have this connection closed off, and all I'm going to do here is take a straight connector and jam that into this side, just like that. Now that that's in, we could go ahead and attach another section of the mainline tubing, and now we're ready to go add some lines to this area over here. Now we've attached that new main line off the original one, and what we're going to do here is I've actually tucked it in to this swale. I built this swale about a couple months ago to capture runoff water from my greenhouse roof and divert it back into the garden. The way this works is that this is all a basin full of wood chips, and then when the water floods it, it helps irrigate my garden as well. But we're not gonna get rain for probably at least 10 months from now or something like that. Here in San Diego, March is pretty much the end of the rainy season. We might get a little bit in April and 1 or 2 random showers in the summer, but I'm not counting on rain for the rest of the year from this point forward. So what I'm going to do here is, once I'm done installing this irrigation, is bury this line up with extra wood chips just to give it a better visual look. And also this needs to get replenished anyway. So the goal here with the onions is I have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows of onions. And what I want to do here is just run a individual 1/4 inch drip line for each row of onions. This is the exact same stuff as the other one, except that it happens to be black because my local retailer carries that, but it's 1/4 inch line with 6 inch spacing between emitters. So all I need to do now is take my hole punch a hole right here, and then I always make sure I put the barb onto the 1/4 inch line first because it's easier to do that and then push it in rather than put the barb in and then try to get the hose on it. So I'm gonna go ahead and attach this, boop, just like that. And I'm gonna run it all the way down to the end of the bed, where I'm going to then plug it up with one of those little goof plugs like I showed you earlier. So I'm gonna do this 4 times, fill out this onion section, then we'll move on to the cabbage region and also a fruit tree that I installed back there and do something a little bit different for those guys. So we're not actually going to be adding any irrigation to the giant cabbages here because they're already basically mature. If I were to add a bunch of irrigation water right now, what would happen is that they'd crack and split open and be sort of ruined. But we do need to actually add irrigation to the tree right back there. That's the tree that I planted in that How to Grow a Fruit Tree Faster video, where I did the multi-year hole method, and I haven't added irrigation to it. So let's go ahead and take a look back there and see a couple different solutions on how to do that. We're down here at the edge of the cabbage patch where I have leftover line. This is that same line that we actually pulled the irrigation for the onions off of, but it was a little extra, so I decided to just wrap it around the bed instead of cut it short, so I could do things like exactly what we're about to do right now, which is add a sprinkler to that fruit tree. So by having it back here, I'm able to bring water to the furthest edge of my garden, where otherwise it'd be actually pretty challenging to bring water to this tree. So what I have here is a 3-way connector, so that's a barb with 1, 2, 3. One of them is going to go into that main line, and then attached to that same setup is I have 2 shutoff valves. These are going to do 2 different things for me. First of all, I could toggle them on or off if I don't want the sprinklers running, and also I might be able to just turn them halfway on if the flow on the sprinkler is a little bit too intense and spraying too far. At least that's my hope here. So I've already made a hole right here in the line. I'm going to go ahead and punch that right in, like so. And so, like I mentioned, I have 2 different styles of sprinkler here. This is the one that I'm hoping I'm going to be attaching to the tree. I actually don't remember the details on these, but both of them are 360 degree, which means that they'll spray in a circle. So this guy's gonna come up here and go at the base of this fruit tree, and we'll see how far that actually runs. And then this one, I'm going to be running into that hugelkultur patch so I could water my wheat. So we now have all the irrigation set up. I want to actually test it to see what all of this looks like and then whether it actually works as I mentioned. It's the end of the day and all the irrigation is now in place. I've turned it on, so let's walk around and see how it's working. First up is the 4x8 bed. This is the first bed that we did. And right here, I wanted to show you guys exactly why you space out your irrigation emitters so they're not all in a straight line. So right here I have a wet zone, down here I have one, and over there. So now this section is not going to remain dry. Whereas if I had the emitters right next to each other, every other spot in between would be drier. So that's why you want to offset the lines when you install it. This is going to be wonderful. I already put the cages back on to stop those raccoons, and I can't wait to see this bed do really well. So just for context, the back is all determinate tomatoes, a couple cauliflower, and then over here I'm going to put in probably 4 indeterminate tomatoes. So now let's take a look at these beds where we set up the 4-way manifold system. So there it is right there. And this is also working really wonderfully. This one is spraying a little bit loose, a little bit wild, but perfect distribution across the bed. And if we needed it to germinate, like let's say I put a bunch of carrots in here, I just turned that guy on, and this is now spraying all over the bed on a nice even misting layer. So that's going to be wonderful for germination. That's the goal there. And then down here, we have the 2x4 bed, which you could also see all those little dark spots. Those are just perfect little drips. So this is going to have perfect coverage of water. A lot of happy plants are going to be grown in here. I can't wait to see how this does. So here's where we connected back into the main line and we jumped into the swale where I pulled 4 1/4-inch lines off into the onions. So now it's definitely getting water. You could see all the wet spots in between. Now I have a chance of actually growing some big onions, maybe not as big as these cabbages, but pretty dang big nevertheless. So this line then comes down here, wraps its way all the way around the bed. And once I harvest these cabbages at the end of this week, I'll be putting 2 of those lines, 2 of the lines right here, the same ones that we did in that 4x8 bed back over there. The idea is that I want this to be very well watered for the tomatoes that are gonna go in here. I'm gonna probably have 1 row there and 1 row there. I did give this area a whole year break without tomatoes, so I'm hoping that's enough. And now there is one of the sprinklers for the tree. So there's the fruit tree. And if I come down here, this is where that little shutoff valve is. So I could just turn it off. Now that sprinkler's off, and then I could just flip it back on if I wanted to. The same goes for this patch over here. I don't know if you see that little sprinkle coming through. I could just toggle that off if I want my wheat to not get any more water, or crank it if I want that to get plenty. The idea is that this wheat patch is not going to want water once this starts to actually turn golden brown, like fully golden brown. I'm going to want to not actually add too much water here because that's going to make the wheat crop worse. So for now, I can run this, but as soon as this starts to turn brown, I'll turn it off. So there's raised bed irrigation and also a couple little side quests to expand my irrigation by the cabbage patch. Now, please leave comments if you want to see the full, complete guide on how to install PVC, how to install timers, zones, all that stuff. I have all the footage. I just haven't been motivated to organize it all because I recorded a lot. I wanted it to be an extremely thorough guide for you guys so that if somebody were to watch that, they'd basically be able to tackle setting up an entire backyard with irrigation if they wanted to. So thanks for watching. Any questions? Put them down below.